the doom loop that you referred to earlier on, the sort of death spiral that we're in terms of it seems like the Chancellor has only two options here: higher taxes, and or lower spending. That actually, if you grow the economy, and the critical thing here is to grow the economy, and the Prime Minister Keir Starmer is right to say that economic growth is the fundamental purpose of the government. He's talked about economic growth. He's talked about wealth creation. He has also talked in the most refined, where his recent refinement of that is talking about increasing household income. The best proxy for household income is GDP per capita. That's what we have to increase, and that's what has fallen for the last two quarters. People tend to focus on the GDP numbers, but I think GDP per capita is a much better indicator of how you're doing as an economy. And there are three things that the UK has always needed to do, whether it was during Liz Truss's premiership or the current situation, and that is increase economic growth. And there are three ways of doing that. One is to reform your regulatory system. There are enormous potential benefits in regulatory reform, and if you look at the budget of 24, of the autumn of 24, actually the direction of travel of regulation was in an anti-competitive direction, with labour rules changing and a bunch of things. The only thing that moved the regulatory reform agenda in a positive way was the planning reforms that were announced, and we in the Growth Commission strongly support planning reform, but it's got to be real planning reform. And if you take out the planning reform and we analyse the budget, it's a -8% GDP per capita projection over the next 20 years. Well, we're on track for that. We can see in the last two quarters, it's looking very much like that.
Liz Truss is attempting to defend herself, as she has done since she was ousted, had to leave office. And this time it's through taking legal action against the Prime Minister's use of the phrase that she crashed the economy. She clearly got things wrong, otherwise she'd still be Prime Minister. But do you think that her diagnosis of what needed to change was right, but the method of delivering it was clearly catastrophically wrong?
Well, I think that her diagnosis was clearly correct, and I think even Rishi Sunak afterwards, when he became Prime Minister, admitted that Liz Truss was not wrong to talk about economic growth. It is the fundamental thing that is going to change the
But
UK's
Rachel Reeves
position.
says she wants to get growth, as you know, on the growth. But she's not doing it, is she?
Yeah, you can say that you want economic growth. You then have to have the policies that actually develop economic growth. And we've in the Growth Commission said that if you do the following regulatory reform things, if you really maximise your trade policy, if you do all of these things, you manage the disruptions from leaving the EU through better border management and so forth, we could generate a 26% GDP per capita gain over the next 20 years. Instead, we're on track to have -8% over the next 20 years. So, she's in her responses to this, I think she's talked about regulatory reform and she's talked about planning reform. That's fine and that's good, but it needs to actually be real. So we need to actually see what it is. I would say there's a whole set of energy-related reforms that are needed. They need to unwind the labour reforms they've put forward, because those are creating significant inflexibilities.
They can't do that. Politically, they can't do that.
Well, politically, that's above my pay grade. I'm just telling you what economically needs to happen. The environmental regulations, some of the net zero things, to be honest, at this point in the UK's economic crisis, need to have a long, hard look at the cost that you're doing, damaging your own economy.
I'll put it to you finally that other major economies are experiencing these kinds of fluctuations in their borrowing prices. And in part, some of that is to do with what might be coming from the other side of the Atlantic when Donald Trump gets in. This isn't a specifically UK problem.
Well, I think there's certainly an element of the potential for the Trump administration, what effect it's going to have, and it'll have differential effects on different countries. But there is a fundamental and much more important, I think, driver for some of this, which is whether it's the bond market or investors or global capital, is saying about the state of the UK market and the state of the UK as an investment opportunity. And what they are basically saying is, until we see some real evidence of economic growth initiatives, we are very sceptical about the UK market. And if you look at the European Union regulatory pipeline, which is vast, when investors hear the government talking about dynamically aligning to the EU regulatory framework, which is going to destroy even more wealth from the UK economy, that does not fill them with confidence. And, on the contrary...
Even though we had higher growth than this when we were inside the EU. Well, we were aligned to those regulations and had way more growth than this, so it can't have been that bad.
Well, the regulations in the EU are a changing, system. I mean, I would say if you looked at the EU in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, you had one set of regulations that, probably arguably were much less anti-competitive than what we are looking, forward to in the future. I would also say if you look at the growth rates of Germany and France, we're in a very... The UK is not massively dissimilar from Germany and France and Western Europe in terms of its lack of growth and lack of GDP per capita growth. We were, in the early 2000s, about 90% of US GDP per capita. We're now 60%, and we're heading to be 40%. So for British people, that is a massive change in the quality of your life and your expectations of life.
Very good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on. Shanker Singham, Chairman of the Growth Commission.